welcome everybody, and I'm very happy to be able to be with you and to share this teaching. If you're at all like me, then you're feeling a little caged in by the world and needing to be out and about a bit. I certainly feel that when I'm learning and sharing learning with people, that's a way of getting out in the world and connecting. So let's use this time to connect with each other, and I do that through Jewish text. So we're going to look at a perennial issue in religious thought, and we're going to look at one specific stab at it. But it's going to be a running jump. We're going to talk about what the issue is and why that's a particular issue for religion in general and monotheism in particular. Then we're going to talk about ways to try to solve that problem, and then we're going to look at how the rabbis do it in the Talmud. And so I'm going to say a few words about the Talmud and about rabbinic discourse. I'm not going to assume that people have an extensive background neither in philosophy nor in rabbinics, so I will try very hard to clarify what I'm saying and to explain it. For those of you who do have some experience or expertise, I apologize. I'll try to be at least entertaining if I'm too basic for you. And the other thing is I am keeping the comment section of the chat section open since you're not able to speak back to me other than by putting things on chat. So I will try to stay present to that as I'm talking in general, okay? So the topic we're going to talk about is why bad things happen. And that's a topic that was made famous in book form several years ago with Rabbi Harold Kushner. I actually had the pleasure of coming to Temple Emmanuel and being on a panel to celebrate the 25th anniversary of that extraordinary book. And he offered his own suggestions, brilliant, I think, whether you find them helpful or not, brilliant about ways of dealing with this based on his own personal life struggles. And we've all had that kind of struggle where you just have to live a certain amount of time and bad things will happen. We will suffer afflictions. People we love will suffer afflictions. There's mortality. We lose a pet. We lose a job. There's all kinds of ways in which life can batter us. And in such moments, it's not at all unusual for people to say, what kind of a world makes this possible? How can this be happening? And what does that mean? And to also be able to ask, why is this happening to me? Am I doing something that causes this to be the reality? Is this some lesson that I'm supposed to be learning? So someone is teaching me in a kind of clumsy and cruel way, but still trying to teach me. Now, that's a problem that no matter what your ideology, no matter what your beliefs, religious, secular, theist, atheist, no matter where you put yourself in those boxes, you're going to stumble against suffering. And you're going to find yourself having a hard time and not knowing what to do with it. But that problem becomes a different problem when you're a believer. So let me just play that out for you. For those of us who don't believe in anything divine, there is no God, the universe is just a big dead machine, things happen purely coincidentally, then honestly, the intellectual challenge isn't why do bad things happen, the miracle is that anything good happens. How is it possible in a totally random universe to have this degree of sophistication, organization, what looks miraculous, even if not in a classical sense? That's a problem for people who don't believe there's some good force organizing the universe. But even for those people, suffering can be crushing. So how you deal with threats to your own health and well-being, how you deal with your own moving through the world and moving through life, that's going to be something you're going to be looking for resources to give you encouragement, to be able to give you resilience, to be able to give you strength. How do you help get yourself through that's a challenge even for people who don't expect deep spiritual meaning. They recognize that the illness just happens. They recognize that things are happenstance, and still it's just really hard to suffer through the suffering of someone you love or yourself, and you look for something to get you through it. I have a relative who's going to console a friend. Neither my relative nor the friend are believers in any religious anything, and yet she called and said, "Do you have any poems that I could bring?" Right? Because we're all carrying a heavy load and we're all trying to do the best we can. So for someone who doesn't believe in God, for someone who doesn't believe in a good God, by the way, another solution to the problem could be, well, there is a divinity or some metaphysical power in charge, but whoever's in charge is evil or utterly indifferent to suffering. And so the reason why they're suffering in the world is because that malicious divinity likes to watch our pain or doesn't care about our pain, or the universe is built on efficiency, not on goodness. That's a reasonable answer. It doesn't make the suffering less, but it's an answer. But it's a unique problem for Jews and Christians and Muslims and any other monotheists who want to affirm at the same time that God exists, that God is loving, and that God is good, right? Because then the question becomes, how is it possible that a good God could make a universe in which things that appear to be terrible happen, right? So I want to dwell on that for a minute, because the classic conundrum for people who are believers in monotheism is the idea that good will triumph. Look, those of us who are Jews, we just celebrated a festival that reminds us that God ultimately sides with the slaves and not with the pharaohs, and that God is the force that is calling Moses and the children of Israel to trust enough to plunge into the sea, knowing that they're going to make it to the other side. There's going to be a promise on the other end. They're going to get to the other end. So if you walk through the world believing that God is good, believing that God is great, believing that things that happen for a reason, which a lot of religious people do, then human suffering becomes a terrible intellectual as well as an emotional burden, right? It hurts just as much as it does for an atheist to feel loss and to suffer those challenges. But on top of that, on top of saying, well, I understand the universe is random, I understand that it doesn't owe me anything, I get all of that. On top of that, you then have the added problem of, I do think that someone is in charge, and I do think that we need to, that I can communicate to that someone in charge. And I believe that that someone is good, so why is this happening to me, right? And that's a problem that goes all the way back to the beginnings of Jewish thought and Jewish scripture. So let's take a look in our heads at kind of a running jump of some places that think about that. You know, the first story in the Torah is the story of Adam and Eve getting kicked out of paradise. So already, at the very beginning of Genesis, there's an awareness that we live in a world that isn't perfect. This isn't a garden, and this isn't a place where everything makes everyone happy. We don't live in that world. That becomes an added challenge for all of us, right? But it's a reflection of the fact that our ancestors, the people who mediated Torah into the world, they were wrestling with this too. I think an even greater example of that is when God visits Abraham and says, I'm going to destroy the city of Sodom and Amorah. I'm going to destroy them because their evilness has reached me. And Abraham negotiates him down. Well, what if there's only 50 righteous people? Will you then save the city? What if there are 40? And at 10, Abraham stops. But even there's an expectation from Abraham. Shouldn't the judge of all the earth do justly? Right? There's an expectation that if God is good, then we should see justice manifest in the world. It shouldn't just be random. Okay, that's more or less how the Bible settles in. So from the book of Exodus through the book of Deuteronomy, there's an expectation that more or less righteousness will result in thriving. Okay? So in the long prayers that accompany the Shema, the watchword of our faith, there's a whole paragraph that speaks about, it's not found in some of the more liberal prayer books, it's found in some of the more traditional prayer books, but that third paragraph speaks about how if you do the commandments, if you observe the commandments, then you will be able to have the rain fall in its time early and late, and your cattle will wax fat and thrive, and you'll have ample harvests and crops, and you'll be able to sustain yourself. So there's a kind of quid pro quo. Do the commandments, and good things will follow. And the Bible doesn't leave to the imagination. If you don't do the commandments, then the rains aren't going to fall on time. And then your cattle will have terrible diseases, and you won't be able to feed your family. So there's an expectation that a life of righteousness will result in an outcome of goodness. People will thrive. People will benefit, right? But it doesn't work that way, right? You can try, and I encourage you all to try it, but it certainly has not been my experience that only evil people suffer, that only evil people get sick. Here we are in the middle of a pandemic that's got all of us confined to our apartments and homes and houses and whatever, and that has already taken a large number of lives all around the country. I'm aware that New York is one of the centers of the devastation, but there haven't been any major areas that are untouched. So if you want to go around assuming that people who behave in a righteous way, they are protected from these harmful behaviors, well, at some point that's going to not work for you, right? At some point, someone you love, possibly yourself, will be suffering, and then you're going to have to say either I deserved it, they deserved it, they brought it on themselves somehow, or you're going to have to say this can't work. I got to come up with a different explanation. And there, one of my favorite biblical books is the book of Job, which I'm assuming many of you are familiar with. The book of Job speaks about this man who is known far and wide for his decency and his goodness. And a cosmic bet gets made. Hasatan, that becomes the English word Satan or the devil, but in Hebrew, Hasatan means the prosecutor. So the one whose job it is in the heavenly court to point out the flaws of the accused. That's what a prosecutor does to this day, to make the worst possible case for them. Hasatan comes to God and says, your creation's entirely mediocre. And God says, well, have you checked out my guy Job? Job is righteous. Job is kind. Job is generous and compassionate. And Satan says, well, that's because you've never hurt him. If you give me permission to start to mess with him, he will curse you just like everybody else, and he will abandon righteousness just like everybody else. And God says, okay, fine, don't hurt him personally. So Satan walks in and wipes out his kids, wipes out his property. He was a rich man with lots of children. He wakes up the next morning, he's neither of those things, and yet still he won't curse God. So Satan goes back to God and says a second time, you need to give me permission to afflict him, because then you'll see he's just like everybody else. And so Satan is given permission. He goes back. He starts to afflict him with all kinds of bodily ailments. And at this point, he gets visited by the worst affliction of all. He gets visited by 3 friends who are theologians. Trust me, when you're sick, you don't want someone to come talk theology at you, because they give him the theology of the book of Deuteronomy. as he's in his suffering, they say to him, you must have done something wrong, because this kind of suffering only happens when you deserve it, right? Because there's a God, and God is in heaven, and nothing happens by mistake, and everything that happens happens for a reason. We've all had people say that kind of stuff to us, right? And so Job's friends come defending the faith, defending God, trying to make the best possible case, and they tell Job, all you need to do now is repent. Just admit that you brought this on yourself, and then God will forgive you and God will relent. And Job, unique in the Bible, says, no, I won't do that. I'm not going to say something I don't believe to be true. I know that I haven't deserved this. I know that I'm not perfect, but I haven't brought this on myself, and so I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to curse God, but I'm also not going to say, God, you're right, I'm wrong, and I demand a reckoning. 3 times the dialogue goes back and forth, with the theologians assuming that if they just repeat this Deuteronomy theology more, that Job will get it, but it doesn't happen. And so finally, in the climactic scene of the book, it's an extraordinary scene, God appears in a whirlwind. Now, how you interpret that whirlwind scene, that's up to your own viewpoint. I can only tell it through how I read it. In the whirlwind, where Job has said, I want to confront God, I want to see you, and I want you to tell me to my face that I deserve this. God appears in a whirlwind, thunder, lightning, big storm, kind of Sinai echoing in the background, and God doesn't answer his question. God doesn't say, yup, you're right, you're innocent. God doesn't say, yup, your friends are right, you're guilty. God doesn't say, I'm perfect and everything I do corresponds to your sense of justice. No, what God says is, who are you to expect the universe to meet your criteria, right? You're a creature within the universe. The universe wasn't made for you, and the universe doesn't respond to your moral outrage or your intellectual sense of reason, right? You weren't there to create the solar system and the planets. You did not make the horse. You didn't make the Leviathan. You haven't created the oceans. I did all of that, so stop fetching. And Job amazingly says, okay, I get it. I'm not the center of things. The universe doesn't owe me an answer. Now, some people read that as an admission that Job was right, and God's kind of saying, you're right. Some people who've read the book read it as a statement that our intellectually trying to make sense out of the universe is always a dead end, because we're always trying to impose human criteria on a world that doesn't meet human criteria. I think that what it's saying is that we live in a world in which we should keep asking questions, keep trying to understand, but recognize that nature's bigger than us, and that there are things that are going to just happen. Not everything happens for the reason. Everything is not a reflection of God's ultimate vision of how things should be. Sorry, Judith, the name of the God book on my desk is God of Becoming and Relationships, the Dynamic Nature of Process Theology. I wrote it. I like it. It's got a pretty cover. It's a different way of thinking about God, and if you want to have me back, I'd be happy to do that talk too. So Job is, in a sense, an existential shifting of the subject. Instead of coming up with a rational explanation, just embrace that life is bigger than your thought patterns. It's also bigger than your morality. So things will happen that don't fit your criteria of goodness, or that don't fit your criteria of logic. And instead of wasting time trying to figure that out, just get on with the business of living, which is how the book of Job ends. And so on one level, a terrible ending. On the other is the only possible ending, which is he has a new set of kids. He enters into some new business prospects that make him a lot of money, and he dies a rich old man with lots of kids. I hasten to say having new kids doesn't in any way remove the terrible pain of losing kids. I don't think the book of Job was implying that. I just think they needed to wrap up the story, and they wrap it up by life, not by theology, not by reason, but by life. He just gets on living. He has to re-enter somehow, and we all face that challenge. We all struggle with whatever we struggle with, and then we all try to find ways to just move on and keep going. Now, what's amazing about that is that that book made its way into the Bible. So the dominant theology is Deuteronomy. Do mitzvot and good things will happen. Don't do mitzvot, you'll pay for it. And there are plenty of Jews to this day who believe that and who will tell you that at the drop of a kippah. But what's amazing is that someone smuggled into the Bible this radical book that seems to be okay with the idea that I don't know why bad things happen. None of us know why bad things happen. On some level, it sounds like even God doesn't understand why bad things happen. We trust enough in the totality to think that you can make meaning in it, but don't expect that to exempt you from suffering. We're all going to suffer. And the challenge is not to be like Job's friends. Don't come up with phony interpretations that make it sound like you understand everything, because you don't. And don't give in to Job's wife, who just says, curse God and die. That's a kind of throwing in the towel that you're not supposed to do either. The best we humans can do, according to the book of Job, the best we can do with this subject is honestly to be ourselves. Don't incriminate yourself falsely. Don't take the blame for something that isn't your fault. And then grieve. Allow yourself to mourn your loss. Allow yourself to feel bereft. Allow yourself to feel rage or sorrow. And then somehow, sometime, pick yourself up and get back in the business of living. Find ways to make connections. Find ways to build meaning and live the days that you have. So Margot is saying that persistence is required and that takes bitachon. Bitachon is a notion of faith, right? So Margot, let's hold on to that notion of faith for a minute. Certainly persistence is required, right? Life is not in the Jewish tradition understood to be easy. It's not for the weak, right? So we all have to try hard. But where Job is not, I think, arguing for what modern people mean by bitachon. Bitachon is a kind of faith that what's happening is meant to be. Job doesn't think that for a minute. That's Job's friends. His faith is despite what happens, it's still worth living. So I'm going to re-enter living, but it's not going to make sense, right? So we've already moved now past the Bible into the rabbinic period, and here religion is kind of hardening a bit. It's taking forms that are more like what we understand. Let me respond to Karen's comment. What's the role of God in prayer? Well, in Deuteronomy, the role of God in prayer is here's my commandments, you do them, and then I'll reward you. Good things will happen in this world, right? Fat cattle, big harvests, lots of money, spouse, kids. That you'll be rewarded now. Job doesn't think that's the role at all. But Job does see that the role of God is presence, that you're not alone in your suffering, that someone is still there with you. And what Job doesn't think is that it's an immoral universe. He thinks it's an amoral universe. It's not a universe to which standards of right or wrong pertain. When a star blows up in a distant galaxy, that's not good or bad. It just is. And so what Job is kind of arguing is that the universe just is. It's not good or bad, but notice that's very different than the book of Genesis. Every day of creation, God says, Tov, Tov, Tov meod. It's good, it's very good. And it's not what most religious people think about when they think about religious views of the world. So by the time you get into the Mishnah and the Talmud, there's also a pervasive sense that righteousness is rewarded and that evil is punished. But I guess what I'm here to tell you is that even in the rabbinic period, there were places where that utterly collapses, and those become, for me, the most interesting places in the Talmud. We don't have time to talk about multiple places. We are going to look closely at one set of passages in Masechet Brachot, the first book of the Talmud. But let's put ourselves in the mindset of the rabbis of the ancient world. The rabbis of antiquity, and by the rabbis of antiquity, I mean from around the year 100 of the Common Era to around the year 600 of the Common Era. That's the period in which the Mishnah, the first book of rabbinic law, was edited and put into written form. That's when the commentaries to it happen and start to be shared. And those commentaries to the Mishnah ultimately congeal in a Talmud. The first one is the Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud, around the year 400 in the land of Israel. And then the Babylonian Talmud from Babylon, Iran, Iraq, and that was around the year 600 or so. These books are of extensive debate and conversation. They absorb the legends of the ancient Jewish world. There's folk wisdom, there's poetry, there's agricultural practice, there's law, there's all kinds of things. So how do the rabbis deal with this? Well, many of them do argue that God is fair. What happens is what God wants to happen, and so you need to do a life of commandments in order for good to happen to you. But there are plenty of stories where that doesn't follow, and they're in the Talmud too. So let me give you an example of that. One of the most famous heretics in the Talmud is a Rabbi Elisha ben Abuya. And he's known by the nickname of Acher, the other one. Once he committed his heresy, the rabbis wouldn't even use his name. But the story is told that what made him a heretic, there are two different versions of the story, both in the Talmud. What made him a heretic in one version of the story is that he was taking a walk one day, took a break from his studies, and he's walking in the field, and he sees a son and his father go up to a tree, and the father says to the son, "Put your ladder against the tree, climb to the top. There's a bird's nest at the top of the tree. Take the eggs out of the tree and bring them down to me." And so the son goes up, and those of you who are attentive to these kinds of things, the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, in 2 places promises that if you observe this commandment, then your life will be long. There are 2 commandments. One of them is honor your mother and your father, that your days should be long in the land. So honor your parents, that gets you long life. The second is, it's a commandment in the Bible that you have to shoo away the mother bird before you scoop up the eggs. Lots of rabbis argue about why that commandment is. I'm not going to go into that right now, but those are the 2 places where the Torah says, do this commandment and your life will be long. So notice that the story is set up so that this anonymous kid is fulfilling both at the same time. His father says, climb the tree, get the eggs, and he does. So he's honoring his father. He goes to the top of the tree, he shoos away the mother bird, he scoops up the eggs. All of that is the 2 places where he's been promised long life. And then, of course, tragedy strikes. And he falls off the ladder, plunges to his death. And at that point, Elisha ben Abuya says to himself, Leit din v'leit dayan. There is no judge, there is no justice. Because if this kid could be fulfilling the 2 arguably most important commandments in the Torah, and nonetheless suffer a terrible accident and a meaningless death, then you just have to admit you live in an utterly random universe. Nothing makes sense. Nothing is for a reason. We just have to live with it, right? And at that point, he stops being observant. He stops being a rabbi. He starts to live a secular life, and the rabbis excommunicate him. Now, there's a whole series of stories about him. If you're interested in reading more about it from a fictional perspective, Milton Steinberg, great rabbi in New York from a previous generation, wrote a book called As a Driven Leaf. I highly recommend it. It's a wonderful novel, and you will enjoy it very much. And it's the fictional account of his life. But look at that. That's already in the time of the Talmud. In the Talmud itself, somebody is enough bothered by the official theology that they're willing to put in this story that says, that's not the way it works. That can't be the way it works. And highlight in this rabbi's telling that he witnessed a universe in which that's not true. The observance of those mitzvot doesn't guarantee you get to live a long life. So that breaks his faith. Nancy, the name Milton Steinberg is the rabbi. He was the rabbi at Park Avenue, and the book is called As a Driven Leaf. It's still in print, by the way. Behrman House has it in print. So wonderful, very compelling book. I think, by the way, I assume many of you are members at Emmanuel. The book is in the library at Emmanuel too, so you could just, at some point when you're able to get out there, although you may want to order it on your Kindle for now. So that means there are people who are helping write the Talmud who are bothered by the fact that life doesn't seem to work the way the book of Deuteronomy says it's supposed to. But I'll give you another Jewish example, right? The temple gets destroyed, right? And there were Jews, both at the first and the second temple's destruction, who said, well, Jerusalem will never be taken because God's given us an eternal promise. God has said, you're my people. So God will never allow the infidels to take Jerusalem and destroy our temple, and yet happened. So you have to rethink your faith at such a moment, and even the most pious of the ancients showed a remarkable openness to recognizing that the world's more complicated than we give it credit for. It's not a simple, good things always happen to good people, bad things always happen to bad people. Once you know what team you're on, then you know what's going to follow. So one of the moves that the rabbis made, along with the Christians, along with the Muslims, was to postpone good things into the next world, right? So you might have innocent suffering now, but someone's keeping tally. And in the next world, that will be compensated for. So there's an argument in the Talmud, not in the part we're going to look at now, but in a part later on, that argues that God's righteousness, God's commitment to the good guys is so great that because there's no person who's perfect, there's no person who's all good, that God will give you your punishments in this world so that you can have all paradise later. That's if you're good. So a person who's mostly good, but makes kind of average mistakes that everyone makes, you have to pay for it. There's no free lunch. So you get minor punishments in this world, sometimes major, but in the next world you get all reward. And someone who's evil, well, they do occasional nice things too, so they need to be rewarded for that. So they get rewarded materially in this world, and then in eternity they get nothing but suffering. That's another set of answers. Okay. It doesn't work for me a whole lot. And I'm always interested in rabbis who are open to messiness. So now I want us to take a look at this passage from Masechet Brachot. And Eric and Ari, if you're able to put it up on the screen now would be a good time. Thank you. There it is. And for those of you who have it, you're welcome to look on your own copy. By the way, I also gave you at the bottom ways to be able to be in touch. So do feel free. Don't drown me in it, but I'm really happy to be connected if I can be helpful. So this is a passage from the beginning of the Talmud. And let me just say a word for those of you who've not studied Talmud in the original. It's not a book, it's a shelf of books. So a couple of years ago, I decided that having been a rabbi for many years, it was time to have read the entire Talmud. If you read a front and back page of Talmud a day, so 2a and b, 3a and b, if you do that every single day, then in about 8.5 years, you can cover the entire Talmud. It was a wonderful experience, not something to undertake lightly, but you find all kinds of things that other people aren't drawn to, and so I've had all kinds of things to teach that I just think are very compelling. This is one of them. Masechet Brachot is the first volume of the Talmud, and it deals with prayer and blessings. And because of that, it has all kinds of interesting theological conversations, and many of them overlap with contemporary Jewish life as well, since the prayers we say are more or less the prayers of the age of the Talmud. So here's what I want to point out by way of background. You're welcome to not agree with me. Lots of people do. Join the club. But I want to tell you what my assumptions are when I read a story like this. So this is a story about two rabbis arguing about a conversation between Moses and God. And what I want to assume is that the rabbis are telling this story not because they're worrying about did it literally happen or not. The issue for them is not, did God really say that to Moses? Did Moses really hear those words? Because that raises all kinds of weird questions. Like, if it's true that God really said it, then why don't we have a single record of it? How can you possibly disagree about what happened there? And if this is true that Moses and God had this conversation, why isn't this in the Torah? So I'm going to bracket that question. Those of you who want to believe literally in the content of the Agadah, the Talmud, you go right ahead. Those of you who want to say, I think this is a piece of creative literature in which the rabbis are fleshing out ideas using the character of God and the character of Moses, that's also perfectly fine. I tend to lean more towards that category than to the second. That's not to say I don't believe in God, and I do think someone named Moses, but I think this is an act of rabbinic imagination. And for me, that makes it more beautiful, not less so, because it means that someone is wrestling with this topic in a way that generates a story to try to make sense out of it. And the fact that the rabbis of old put this into the Talmud means they thought that the topic was important enough and the wrestling in this story was important enough that it was worth anyone who wanted to become knowledgeable in Judaism to know. I think that that's a genius statement of the Talmud, and I'll just share with you one fact about the Talmud before we jump into this. The Talmud, that shelf of rabbinic debates, contains about 5,000 arguments. Someone actually counted them out. A little over 5,000. Of the 5,000, 50 are resolved. That is to say, the vast majority of arguments in the Talmud are never settled, because arguments are always more interesting than answers. Arguments open it up, and you can argue about things you don't definitively know, but once you have an answer, then that answer is either right or wrong, and you're done. So the Talmud is the world's greatest book of questions and wrestling, of conversations without end. And they just flit from one to the other without finishing it, meaning you're always free to go back to the conversation. So in that spirit of openness, let's take a look at this wonderful rabbinic telling. So you have it in the original Aramaic or Hebrew, and I'm going to read it in the English so we're all on the same page and to make sure we get to finish it in time. Rabbi Yochanan further said in the name of Rabbi Yossi, 3 things did Moses ask of the Holy Blessing One, and they were granted to him. All right, so this is setting the story. I want to point out a couple things. First is, anyone who's a student of Talmud would be familiar both with Rabbi Yochanan and with Rabbi Yossi, 2 of the great rabbis of the Talmudic tradition. I want to highlight that Rabbi Yochanan says the name of the person he heard this teaching from. Right? Judaism is an oral tradition, so it's only as reliable as the chain of sages who pass along the wisdom. Right? And so it's a mark of rabbinic wisdom, of rabbinic tradition, that this isn't about the greatness of the individual. It's about the greatness of the group. The rabbis are not concerned with their own personal reputation. They're concerned with the reputation of Judaism as a whole, maybe even the rabbis as a whole. So it's an act of grace to quote the person who you heard the teaching from. And that's what he's doing. He's giving Rabbi Yossi credit. And now enters the story. Moses made 3 requests of God, and according at least to Rabbi Yossi's version of the story, God said yes to all 3. So here we go. I'm going to read the next paragraph. Moses asked that the divine presence should rest upon Israel, and that was granted to him. As it is said, is it not in that you go with us, so that we are distinguished, I and your people, from all the people on the face of the earth? He asked that the divine presence should not rest with idolaters, and that also was granted to him, for it says, so that we are distinguished, I and thy people. He asked that God should show him the ways of the Holy Blessing One, and that was granted too. As it says, show me now your ways. Now let's learn how rabbis argue something, or how rabbis flesh out a story. It makes a claim, and then it justifies the claim by quoting the Torah. So the Torah here functions as a proof text. How do you know that something's true? Because the Torah says so, right? So the first is that don't leave us alone, God. Be present among us. And we know that that was answered because of this verse in the book of Exodus that says that we will be distinguished by virtue of the fact that you go with us. And indeed, there's a pillar of smoke and a pillar of fire that accompanies Israel throughout its wanderings, and then we build a temple in Jerusalem, and God dwells in the temple. So there's a long-standing notion that God is present among the community of the children of Israel. In traditional Jewish practice, there has to be a minyan, 10 adults, before you can say all of the words of holiness, all the words of prayer. That's a measure of an echo of this idea that God is present in a special way when we gather as a community. But it's not enough for Moses that God is just with the Jewish people. Moses also wants God to not be with the other people. So Moses' second request is, great that you're going to hang out with us, but I know you have the capacity to hang out in more than one place, so I also want you to not hang out with people who are idolaters. And we know that is true because it says we are distinguished, meaning here's something that's different between us and other people. What's different? We worship the one true God, and God hangs out with us. Idolaters do not worship the one true God, and therefore God does not hang with them. So God has said yes, 2 out of 2 so far. And then the third one, he asks that God should show me God's ways. And it's granted, show me your ways. Now, here the Talmud does something that's often difficult in learning. Unless you know what the Talmud's talking about, you don't know what the Talmud's talking about. What does it mean by show me your ways? This isn't how, God, do you make a tomato bisque? Or how did you fashion the chicken? I'd like to know. This is, why do people suffer? Right? The core question of God's ways in the world for any monotheist has to be, if God is good, why is there suffering? Right? And so the rabbis understand that that's what Moses is asking when he says, show me your ways. I don't get why there's so much pain. I don't get why this is so hard. Explain that. Okay, so then Moses says to God, sovereign of the universe, why is it that some righteous people prosper and others suffer? Why is it that some wicked people prosper and others suffer? So now, in the Talmud, this is making the previous question explicit. When I said, show me your ways, what I meant is, I don't get why it is that some people do all the right things. They make themselves lovable. They extend themselves to other. They observe the Sabbath. They keep kosher. They do whatever you want to define as the right thing. They do, and yet it's not only so random that you can't tell who's good or evil by their suffering, but it's not even fair. Some righteous people do really well. That might lead you to think, okay, righteousness is a good insurance policy. But some righteous people suffer, so then it makes me think it's totally random. And then some wicked people suffer, but some wicked people prosper. So that's what Moses is saying to God when he says, show me your ways. He's saying, I don't see your ways when I look in the world. Right? When I look out at how people are living their lives and what's going on in the community, I don't see a world made by a righteous God who's in charge. It looks to me completely arbitrary. And that flies in the face of my thinking of you as the sovereign of space and time. Okay, I hope you're with me. If this were in a real classroom, I would stop and say I wouldn't get what the problem is, so I hope you do. So now God answers. And again, I want to remind you, this is not a direct answer coming from God. This is coming from the character God as imagined by the anonymous author of this rabbinic story. God says to him, Moses, the righteous person who prospers is a righteous person who is the child of righteous people. And the righteous person who suffers is a righteous person whose parents were wicked. A wicked person who prospers is a wicked child of righteous parents. And a wicked person who suffers is a wicked person whose parents were wicked. Now, it's a brilliant answer. If you're like me, it's not a very satisfying answer, but it's brilliant. So, the character of God in this story is conceding Moses' point. Yes, I know it looks arbitrary because some righteous people do well and some righteous people suffer. Some wicked people suffer, which you'd expect, but some wicked people are doing fine, right? So this is the Talmud admitting, yeah, that requires an explanation. And now someone is going to try to save the idea that this is a universe that makes sense, right? And the way they're going to save it is they're going to say, well, a righteous person whose parents are righteous is going to be, well, hi, Amy. What makes the answer brilliant is that it saves, at least for a moment, the idea of a rational universe that rewards goodness. It just kicks it back a generation. It says, you don't harvest your own behavior, you harvest your parents' behavior. Yes, Harvey, that's exactly the sins of the father being visited on the children, or the righteousness of the parents being visited on the children, right? So this retains the idea that there is a kind of ecology of decency, right? It may not be one-on-one. It may be that a person is wicked, but if their parents were good, then there's been goodness put in the bank, so to speak. And that interest is available to be withdrawn, right? So if your parents did good, then you can call upon that. But if your parents did evil, then there's going to be recompense. And so your suffering will be for them. Now, hold on, because the Talmud itself is not going to see that as ultimately a satisfying answer. But I do want to highlight to you that this is an effort within the narrative to still preserve the possibility of a universe that makes sense. It's a universe in which there is a connection between the behavior of people and the outcome, but not one-on-one. So it's already conceding that in the universe we live in, there isn't always a direct link between how you, an individual, behave and what happens to you. They move it back a step. Okay, let's move to the second page now. We can. Okay, so now someone's going to argue with this, and here's this incredible act of rabbinic courage. Amar Mar, the master said, the righteous person who prospers is a righteous person, child of a righteous person, and the righteous person who is in adversity is a righteous person, the child of a wicked person. But that's not true. For behold, one verse says, visiting the iniquity of the parents upon the children, and another verse says, neither shall the children be put to death for the parents. Now I want us to focus on this for a minute because the audacity of this paragraph is one of the examples of why I adore the Talmud. The Talmud is the most raucous piece of literature the world has ever produced. The master here, who's the master? The master is God. So some anonymous rabbi is going to now argue with God. This isn't from Moses. This is from within the rabbis now. Someone read that last paragraph, the one we just read, and said, ugh, that's ridiculous, right? And so they acknowledge, yeah, the character of God said that, but it can't be true. And how do we know it's not true? They're not going to use the argument you and I might use, which is, well, because I paid attention to the world. They say, no, no, no. There's a contradiction within the Torah, because you have the book in the book of Exodus that says you visit the iniquity of parents upon children. All right, so in that universe, you might be able to say the righteous person whose parents are evil is going to suffer, and the righteous person whose parents are righteous won't. But the book of Deuteronomy already knows that the book of Exodus can't be true on a literal level, because the book of Deuteronomy goes on to establish children are not put to death for the sins of their parents. Right? You can't measure someone's worth or their parents' worth by what happens. It's fair to hold people accountable for their own choices and their own behavior. You've already conceded in that last paragraph on page 1, you've already conceded that there's no direct link between an individual's choice and what happens to them. You tried to save it by kicking it back a generation, but already the book of Deuteronomy says, no, you can't do that. That's not possible. The universe can't work that way. That's utterly immoral. So a contradiction is pointed out between these two verses. And the answer is given, well, there's no real contradiction there. The one verse deals with children who continue in the same course as their parents, and the other verse is about children who don't. Now let's, again, before you decide whether you agree with this or not, let's take a look at what they're arguing here. They're trying to now reconcile that Deuteronomy objection with the verse by saying, well, yes, on the one level you might read those two verses, the one in Exodus, the one in Deuteronomy, as contradictory, but they're not really contradictory because one of them deals with children who make the same choices their parents did. If your parents were righteous and you continue their righteousness, then you receive reward. If your parents chose evil and you chose evil like them, you will suffer because you continue their choices. So there's a multi-generational possibility of tshuva. You can decide not to continue the pathway of your parents if your parents' choice was wrong, and then you won't be punished for them. Now, this is still just digging us deeper and deeper in the weeds, right? Remember Moses' original show me your ways is help me make sense in a way that means the universe isn't arbitrary. This is a second level attempt to do that, okay? It's true that the objection you raised before is a valid one. There seems to be a contradiction, and so he removes the contradiction by saying, well, it's really two subsets of children. Kids who continue their parents' way, they will suffer or be rewarded for that. Kids who break with their parents, they will suffer or be rewarded for that. Hey, notice it's a two-level defense, but each defense is a retreat. Each defense is an acknowledgement, yeah, this answer isn't working very well. This is not doing the heavy lifting. You must therefore say that what the Lord said to Moses was a righteous person who prospers is a perfectly righteous person. And the righteous person in adversity is not a perfectly righteous person. And the wicked person who prospers is not a perfectly wicked person, and the wicked person in adversity is not a perfectly wicked person. Now, this is the defense I gave you before, right? Someone who is 100% righteous will get 100% goodness in this world, but most of us are not. So when you see a righteous person suffering, you have every right to assume they are in fact righteous, but they're not perfect. And so they are getting whatever compensation they need to get in this world, so that in the next world they have only paradise, only reward. And the same in the opposite with a wicked person. Someone who prospers and is wicked is someone whose little bit of goodness is being rewarded now, and the wicked person who suffers is just all wicked, and therefore they're suffering. Okay, final paragraph. You need to move it up a little bit, please. All right, thank you. Now, this is the saying of Rabbi Yochanan in opposition to what Rabbi Meir said. Rabbi Meir said, only 2 requests were granted to Moses, and one was not. For it is said, I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious, although they may not deserve it, and I will show mercy on those who I will show mercy, even though they may not deserve it. So notice what's being played out here. The first part of this, all the way up to that end of the last paragraph, that's the Rabbi Yochanan side. That is to say, they're trying to make sense of the rationality of the world. Good things happen for a reason, bad things happen for a reason, although each time Rabbi Yochanan is having to retreat because the arguments are getting harder and harder to sustain. Rabbi Meir, another great Tana, has a whole different perspective entirely. He says, of the 3 things Moses asked for, only 2 did God say yes. Yes, I will be with the children of Israel. Yes, I will refuse to be with idolaters. But as for showing you my ways, meaning laying out for you how this is a reasonable universe in which only people get what they deserve, no, can't do that because that's not the case. And they pick 2 biblical verses that show randomness. I will be gracious to those to whom I'm gracious. I will show mercy to those to whom I will show mercy, which is to say there are no criteria by which you judge that. This is just, that's biblical language for it just happens that way. That's all. It just happens. Now, I want to say a concluding thought, and then I want to, in the 15 minutes left, open it up for Q&A for you. All right, so thank you. Look at the extraordinary notion of a religious literature that doesn't give you the final answer. What the Talmud did here was say, this is a question worth asking, and this is worth batting around. So we're going to talk about it in ways that doesn't come up with a conclusion. At the end, we don't know, is Rabbi Meir right and Rabbi Yochanan wrong? It doesn't say that. It just presents, here's the Rabbi Yochanan position, here's how he tells the story. Well, what about it if you challenge it here? Okay, then he would fall back to this. Okay, fine. And what if you challenge that second fallback with this? He would fall back to this. And then Rabbi Meir steps in and says, yeah, those are rotten answers. Here's my way of answering it, and mine is a better way. And then the Talmud moves on. So there's no final, Rabbi Meir was right, Rabbi Yochanan is wrong. Does the universe make logical sense? Do your best to try to figure that out. Is it random? Try to figure that out. The Talmud is more interested in our engaging in the conversation, in our thinking together about this really deep question. And I want to close with 2 caveats. The problem with the best theodicy in the world, theodicy is the term for why do bad people suffer, is that it doesn't make the suffering go away. right? So even if you come up with a reason for why it happens, even if you come up with a religious reason, you're still going to have people suffer and it's still going to hurt. So in that sense, it's kind of a secondary engagement. But it's also true that it's human nature to try to make sense out of the world, to try to understand. And in an important way, what the Talmud does is move this from an intellectual challenge to an invitation to do something about it. So that the Jewish response to suffering shouldn't be, this is an intellectual problem, let me cogitate about its metaphysics. The Jewish response should be, that person needs my help, I'm going to roll up my sleeves and help, right? And certainly in this time we're living through, there's lots we can be doing to help each other. We can be calling people so they don't feel lonely. We can be reaching out. We can be expressing gratitude to the first care providers. We can be sheltering ourselves so that we don't put people at risk and don't put ourselves at risk as burdens to others. We can be contributing to nonprofits that are struggling so badly. We can make sure that people who are dependent on our salaries, we try to keep them engaged. There's lots we can do. And this kind of framework liberates us to re-enter the world as God's hands, rather than to step outside of the world and simply reflect. I hope this has been helpful to you, and I'm open to whatever questions you want me to field. And Eric and Ari, you're going to have to help me know how I do that. Like, I don't know what that means here.
You mean, well, we can just ask people to continue writing them in the chat box.
Great.
Not entirely sure where you left off, but
also let me go back in the midst of this.
Sure.
Stephen Lee, that Acher doesn't lose faith in God, he loses faith in Judaism. Not so clear. In the story, he certainly loses faith in Judaism. He's not at all observant, but he becomes utterly secular. He violates Shabbat, he doesn't study Torah, he doesn't pray, and when he dies, he goes to hell, to Gehenna, and he burns, and his student, Rebbe Meir, is the one who pulls him out of punishment. So I think he's understood as being someone who has denied God, not just denied Judaism, but there were no purely ideological atheists in the ancient world. You either did religion or you didn't, so that was how it got measured. Okay, Brenda. Brilliant comment, Brenda. It's perverse. A righteous person from an evil person has more to overcome and therefore should be rewarded more. Yes, that would seem to be fair, but that isn't what this Talmud story is about. So stories in the Talmud are always to make a particular point, not like abstract philosophy where they give you everything you need to think about a whole subject. So this isn't a disquisition on what counts as the best reward and punishment system. This is trying to make a particular argument in a particular context. I agree with you, and Judaism says as much, that in a place where a penitent sinner stands, even the high priest does not merit to stand. Someone who has come farther deserves to be credited for that. All right, there's 8 more messages here.
Mm-hmm. Okay, there's one comment from Jeffrey, which I think might be interesting to touch upon. How do the rabbis understand free will if our parents' behavior determined our fate? I know you touched upon it when you were talking, and that's an interesting topic.
Okay, so our parents' behavior does influence us, and free will is never absolute. We always have the ability to make choices within the constraints of our history, our temperament, our personality, our income, our age. So I know for myself that choices my parents made are deeply embedded in my psychology and appear invisibly when I make choices. I automatically assume it must, but sometimes you experience in life people or opportunities to say, oh, it doesn't have to be the way my family did it, and that's where free will kicks in. But I think most of us default to the way we were raised, even when we promised ourselves not to. Um, Karen Brody is saying that if God is immanent and non-interventionist, then we avoid the issue of divine causality. Well, that is true. You then have other issues. If God is just a steady background to everything and doesn't act in particular moments, then it's hard to know the difference between God and no God. It becomes a really abstract presence, I suppose. And then it's hard to know why you would care at all about this God or any organized religiosity as a way of connecting to the divine. So, yes, that would solve that one particular problem, and then it would raise new and other ones.
Lori has a question.
Is this?
Say it again?
Is that the one? Is this thought in the Talmud about good and evil?
Uh-huh.
That goodness is not a reward from God, but rather its own reward. So, I don't think that Torah, well, yes. There is a verse in the Mishnah that says, mitzvah goreret mitzvah, avera goreret avera. So a mitzvah leads to the doing of another mitzvah, and a sin leads to doing another sin. So that is to say, the reward and punishment are not extraneous to the doing of good and evil deeds. They are, they flow. And so you kind of train yourself in the doing of good deeds, and that makes doing good deeds easier, and that's its own reward. The joy of righteousness is its own reward. But the Talmud doesn't definitively say that's the only way that goodness is rewarded. There are plenty of places in the Talmud where it's rewarded in additional ways as well. But I do think there's a strong voice in the Talmud that doing good is something you do for its own sake. The study of Torah is something that brings joy on its own, in addition to whatever long-term benefits it also brings. Jeffrey wants to know if Job was a Jew. No, he was not a Jew. He's explicitly listed not as Jewish, and that creates a conundrum for all kinds of people down the road. This non-Jew who apparently has an intimate closeness with God, and apparently what he was committed to was decency. So not necessarily a kosher kitchen, but a kosher heart. Janet, I always thought that the saying that God works in mysterious ways was rather simplistic, and now I wonder if there might be something in it. Yes. So, look, the way that God works in mysterious ways is said is usually to retain belief in an all-powerful, all-knowing God, even though it looks like something crummy just happened. I find that utterly unhelpful. I don't believe in an all-powerful God. I believe in a very powerful God who is masked. So when you're saying God works in mysterious ways in the context of this teaching, I think we're meaning something very different than what the people who wrote the prayer. And by the way, that's a great Anglican song now that you can go online and hear a choir sing it. It's meant as a defense of an all-powerful God simply by saying, well, you can't connect what happens back to God, but God is still all-powerful, so trust. It's also a statement that ultimately it's going to turn out okay in the end, and I don't know that either. So I think this is offering us something different, which is this world isn't a morality play, and there's no simple quid pro quo, and we have to create meaning without that. That's a much bolder position. Now, you can use that and say God works in mysterious ways, but that's kind of turning the statement on its head, which is okay. That's fair. Harvey, Rabbi Soloveitchik, sorry, I'm being confused here. Harriet, you mean Jonah, right? When Jonah is on the ship, he does say he's a Jew. That's because Jonah is a Jew. but not Job. He avoided sea travel, from what I know. Soloveitchik says evil is an undeniable fact. There's evil, there's suffering, there's hellish torments in the world. Yes, he does. Why do bad things happen? Soloveitchik says, don't look for metaphysical reasons, look towards a halachic approach. Yeah, I'm not sure that works for me. A big part of the argument for the halachic approach for Soloveitchik is he assumes that it's still literally God's will. So a God who can literally command us to wait 6 meals between meat and milk, but doesn't literally control the world. What Soloveitchik doesn't do, I think, in my opinion, is the hard work of explaining how is it possible that a God who allows random evil in the world is still a God who cares about punctilious details of Jewish law. And I understand in his world that's not a burning question, but it sure is for me. So I think Soloveitchik is dodging the question more than solving it. How do I, as a rabbi, reconcile the mystery of evil? Evelyn, that is a great question. And we have 3 minutes left. So what I will tell you as a rabbi and a theologian is I can't possibly reconcile it in 3 minutes. What I can tell you is to take a look at the God book, that book, if you want, or you can have me back to do a talk on process theology, and then I'll be very happy to share thoughts on what I think is God's relationship to the world and evil and our self-agency. And with that, I think we're out of time, so I'm going to thank everybody for the chance to learn together.
Thank you so much. It's always such a pleasure to have you, and we of course will have you back. There have been just a couple of questions about, can you just repeat the name of the book that you referenced about Alicia Ben?
Yes, the book is by Milton Steinberg, and it's called As a Driven Leaf.
Great. As a Driven Leaf. And yes, it is in the library. It might be on our ebooks if you have an ebook membership.
Yeah, especially these days, you might want to go for the ebook.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Thank you so much. And everyone, we will re-email out the source sheet one more time. Please don't inundate Rabbi Artson with emails, but if you have a couple of follow-up points, I'm sure he would be happy to get back to you. And we look forward to welcoming you back here again.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Good to see you all, and stay healthy, stay safe.
Yes, stay healthy, stay safe, and we'll see you guys next week when we start a next round of classes on Monday morning. Thanks so much, everyone, and early Shabbat Shalom. Bye.